Welcome to MassMusings, a podcast where art and history come together, brought to you by the Massillon Museum. On today's episode, we interview current Studio M artist Susan Byrnes about her exhibition, the Viscosity Series, which is on view through January 26, 2022.
Welcome to MassMusings. I'm so pleased to be here today speaking with Anna Young, who is our social media manager and podcast producer. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Emily. Hi, Susan.
Hello. And I wanted to introduce our guest to you today. Susan Byrnes is a visual artist whose artwork encompasses traditional and contemporary forms and practices, including sculpture, multimedia installation, radio broadcasts, writing, and curatorial projects. Her art has been exhibited in galleries and museums throughout the Midwest, including in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Amarillo, Texas. Byrnes teaches as part of the Ohio Arts Council Arts Learning Artist in Residence program and is a contributing art critic and writer for both online and print publications. Her audio pieces, based on artists and art-making processes, have been broadcast on public radio stations in Ohio and Kentucky. She earned an MFA from Eastern Michigan University and a BFA from Syracuse University, and she is based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, let's get started. I'd love to hear about the concept of this series. If you would describe it and tell about the process you invented to create these colorful sculptural drawings.
Sure. So process really is the word with these pieces. The title of the series, and it's an ongoing one, the Viscosity Series, it really is about the viscosity of the liquid material that I use when I make these pieces. It's a material that cures. It's a polyurethane rubber. And so it has a brief window of time when it's very liquid, and then it becomes thicker and thicker. And at a certain point, you can kind of pour it in that window and make different effects with the material. And so over the years I've used this material, I've learned how to manipulate it and control it differently, and it is inexact. So it's always new to me. It's always different. And every time I launch into making a series, I learn from the process I undertake with it. So there are definitely similarities between bodies of work from different years, but there are real relative similarities between pieces that are made within a window of time. So my invention of it really has to do with my background in sculpture. My MFA is in sculpture, and I did a lot, and I still do a lot of casting. So in the mold making process for casting various materials, you often use a polyurethane rubber, and the polyurethane rubber is often like an amber kind of color, and it's a really compelling material, but it's not often used as the final product. And at a certain point when I was making molds, I also had a lot of dry pigments sitting around my studio, and I started, when I had extra polyurethane rubber, I started to mix color into those. And if I had a mold that happened to be sitting there or something, I would just pour it into the mold to see what it looked like. And it began to give me ideas about casting the form in this material. And so I have a series of pieces that are colored polyurethane rubber, but I also was very interested in abstract drawings, and I began to just make forms and lines and shapes with the colors to see what kind of edges I could make, what kind of boundaries I could make. So I made small molds, very shallow ones, so that I could work with this material more as a drawing. And that evolved over probably 10 years of practice.
Wow. So as with any invention, I know there are obstacles and surprises along the way. And it sounds like, to this day, this is something that carries some serendipity and surprise as you were working with it. What are some of the obstacles that you overcame and challenges that you had as you created this?
Well, initially when I started, I was using a different rubber material that I would use for my mold making. So I've evolved to a material that's it's a little bit harder than the initial one I was using. So this material is quite soft. If you were to touch it, it's not really spongy, but it's very soft, and it's really, it's just like a compelling material to touch. So when people see the works, they often want to poke them and see, like, what is that made out of? So initially, the material was kind of amber colored, and it was very soft. So as I made different series, I began to use a harder rubber, a little bit harder, the next one up. And also I found a water clear rubber so that I could color it with the colorants, and you can actually also use it clear, so that I could start to play with opacity and transparency with the colors. So that entered into my process. The other thing I learned as I went along is using the dry pigments. The mixing of the pigment into the material actually weakens it, the colorant. So with powder, that's worse. So I've begun to use liquid colorants that are very strong, and you need only a very little bit, so it doesn't compromise the integrity of the rubber material that I use. So those are a couple of things. Other things, challenges are really how to display this material, because I've gone through different surfaces behind it, from mirrored surfaces, which work really beautifully to bounce light through the material, to putting light behind it as in a light box. And that works more successfully with some pieces and not so much with others. So it has to be the right piece. To, even the challenge of how to adhere the material to the base that I show it on. And some people have talk to me even about the possibility of not using a base and letting the material flop and move. And so that may be a direction I will go in going forward.
That's so interesting. I love the tactile, very compelling visual and textural component of your work. And in fact, you were talking about people seeing the work and wanting to touch the work. So I thought it was really generous that you brought in a sample piece specifically for people to touch just that piece and not the artwork in the exhibition, so that they could satisfy that urge, because it is a very appealing surface that you've created.
So I'm interested in your choice to use this material versus a resin, just because I know, as someone who also works with similar materials like this, it can be very finicky, and you have to really know what things bond with what you can use. Like the colorants, you have to be very specific about what you use, and all of that for curing. And so I was interested to know why you chose this material versus like a resin that's not quite as finicky. I mean, it still has its challenges as well.
So with this material, I think initially I chose it because I already had it around, and I kind of learned to do things with it. When I've used resins, they cure very, very quickly. And so I played with those too, doing different kinds of techniques and trying this technique with it. But because it's so fast, I really can't do the same kinds of things that I do with this polyurethane rubber. And the reason is definitely the timing, because if I'm using polyurethane rubber and I mix it, I've got about a 20-minute window from when it's very thin liquid to when it begins to kind of cure and thicken. So it gets to the point where it's first it's very runny. So I pour this into a shallow mold and I level everything out. Usually, but if it's very runny, I can't control hardly anywhere where it goes. I can't make a shape with it. So oftentimes I'll wait until it's about halfway. So it's a little stickier and I can begin to make shapes. But then if I have another batch mixed up that's thinner, I can pour that into it and it begins to erode the hard edge. So I can make softer edges and harder edges. Or if I have two colors that I want to make a very hard edge against each other, I can pour them next to each other and then get a really gorgeous line if I want to. So within that 20-minute window, I can do both things. Plus I can mix up quite a lot of it and have time to pour it, because sometimes like on those pieces that have the 4 tiles that are next to each other, I will mix up batches in a certain way so I can get consistent color through. And I wouldn't be able to do that with a resin that I wouldn't have time to pour it and it would be done. So that's the reason why I continue to go back to this material, because it gives me enough time that it can set up for me to do what I want to do, but enough time that I can play with it too.
Yeah. And are you using like what material, like what product, I guess, like brand name? Are you using like a Smoothon? Or are you using like a 2-part, like even 2-part mixture, something that's easier? Because I know sometimes some are easier to mix and some are a lot more.
Yeah, no, I can't do math with this. So I avoid the real complex ones. When I first learned how to make molds, the studio where I was, they used a ridiculous Smoothon product with, you had to measure it out in tiny bits and that I don't like that either, because, but I do use Smoothon and I use, what is the product now? I've used this for years and I'm the only person who calls the guys in Columbus. They're the distributor for Smoothon, because you can't buy it in the quantities I buy it from. I buy like 15 gallons at a time from them. And they're like, oh, we got your card on file. We know who you are because no one else does this. Yeah. So anyway, so that's the material I use. I think it's the clear. It's a Shore 50 hardness is what it is. So it's that one, whichever. There's only one like it, and I can't remember the name of it now. But anyway, what I do with this material also is, because it's very finicky, I'm terrified of rain because it can put bubbles into your mold. However, I have a mistake piece from a long time ago that has air bubbles in it like that. And it's actually quite a beautiful effect. And I'm going to go back and try some of these mistakes again, but I haven't yet. I really did like it. However, I only cast these materials over the summertime. And in Ohio, it's very humid. So I have to watch out for rainy days. But the core temperature in my studio is going to be about 70 degrees, maybe a little bit cooler than that. And then I can leave them and they'll cure at the proper temperature. So I don't pour in the winter. I use a lot of ventilation in my studio space, windows open, attic vent in there. It just sucks everything out. I'm very cautious of that, because it's not a very safe material. Don't do it at home. Although my studio is in my garage, so it's detached though. So I don't technically do it at home. Anyway.
Yeah, that's very important. I was going to ask you with the bubbles, because I know that's a big problem. And if you don't have a degasser, there's little tips and there's tricks that you can kind of make it work the way that you want to, including pouring really high. But if you want to have control, over like your really specific lines and beautiful marks and gestures, it's hard to pour high to get that.
Yeah. I'm not that concerned about them mostly. And here's why, because I use the bottom surface of my mold as the front. So when I pour, all the bubbles rise and they're on the back.
Yeah.
There have been only very few instances when I've wanted to turn the piece the opposite way. So I don't have a problem often with bubbles on the bottom. They'll just be in the back.
Yeah, that works great.
Yeah.
Well, the next question I had was, how many layers is your most layered artwork and how long did it take?
So I fantasize, I think about doing a piece that has many, many, many layers in it that takes me, a month, like a big piece. And this is somewhere that I'll get to, but I haven't really done that yet. So oftentimes my pieces are like maybe 5, maybe 6 layers of color. And then that's enough for me, because I don't want to, I sort of plan my colors. And then I really like subtle tonalities in the different colors, especially like in those greens you can see in the Prairie series. And so I could do that a lot more, but I usually do like 2 or 3 of those and then work with a foreground, kind of middle ground, and then a background color. So at some point I will do more. But it's also the smaller the amounts you get, it's almost harder to mix those things up. So, I mean, it's not that hard, but I can't do tiny, tiny amounts, so I don't want to waste a ton of material either. It's expensive.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So one of the things that I love is standing in the gallery in front of some of your larger artworks and just letting the colors fill your field of vision as you're looking, and kind of have it wash over you. What do you think about the scale of the artwork? You were explaining how you started small, but talk a little bit about scale, and then also choosing a square mold as a unit to build the larger pieces.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you asked this question. I'm also so glad for your observation, because I am actually really interested in the idea of mesmerizing the viewer and having the viewer have an experience where their field of vision is completely filled in with these repeating forms and brilliant colors, so that they can experience a space of imagination. I really am not in many of the works trying to represent anything at all except an experience of space. And so these pieces have a little bit of a depth to them. So it provides you some variation in the depth that you see. But interestingly, I did start with small pieces with this, but I think in maybe 2013 or 2014, I got a community supported art award grant. And this was, have you heard about community supported agriculture, where
Yes.
people will do things and you get a basket of different kinds of fruits? Well, they did this in the community with artists, and they sold 50 sets of art. So 9 artists had to make 50 small things. And so I applied with this material in a 6x6 frame. And so I got that. And my challenge was to make 50 of these pieces. They didn't all have to be the same, but they were all the same material, the same process. And so when I did that, I think the very next year, I applied for a commission at the Dayton Metro Library, and Dayton Metro Library was commissioning very significant pieces for brand new libraries. And this was their main one. So they were going for it. And I went for it too. There was a huge wall, and I proposed to make 60 2-foot by 2-foot squares that came together in a huge mural piece. But the only way I could think that I could manage to do it was in small pieces. And so having the experience of doing the 56 by 6 ones helped me understand the process. And then I made this ginormous piece that was based on Monet's water lily murals. And that, of course, takes up your whole field of vision. So I made a piece that was 10 feet high by 24 feet wide. And it does that. And so after that commission, I keep trying to get back to that big scale, that giant scale, but on a scale like I can store and manage. And so I almost see these 2 foot by 2 foot and even the 4 foot by 4 foot pieces as a piece of something bigger, which is kind of where my mind goes. I want to make different elements of landscape and spaces of depth and textures and colors that vibrate, that move people around, like the piece that I did that's in the Dayton Metro Library.
That piece sounds amazing. And now it's like a destination. Go to see it. So I think you've kind of answered this a little bit already with your description, but what took you away from a composition with just one main focal point in favor of creating a dynamic pattern and variation with multiple focal points?
I just want the viewer to be really lost in a different kind of space. I think about part of the space we live in now is the space of the screen, right? That we live in these spaces of flat surfaces, and we are making the depth in there. So the nature of this material and its grid-like nature, that to me makes me think of things like virtual reality. It makes me think of video game space. It makes me think of the way that we construct depth based on screens and the glassiness even of that. And so, my objective is not really so much about trying to make this material do something as it is to let it be the space that absorbs us. I can't really explain it any other way than that. Even though some of the works that I've made are more representational, and that's more recent work, I still love that thing where, like, I forget what it's called, but you can't see two things at the same time, kind of in a space. Like either you're looking at the details of the way the piece is formed, or you're moving back and you're seeing that it's this kind of vista in those Prairie pieces. But I really do like that even when you move close to these, the larger pieces or even the smaller ones, you can see how the piece is made. You can see the depth in it. And then when you stand back, it becomes this kind of other spatial meaning a little bit, a grid or a pattern or something.
Right. There's definitely a push and pull, dynamic going on. And there's something between the flatness of the surface and the just lusciousness of the material that draws you in. But then there are parts that are reflective. And I think it's in Pink Prairie, which is a square artwork of yours that has some of that clear resin, so you can see through the layers. There's just all this dimensionality, and then it's flat at the same time. I didn't know if you had scratched into that surface when you first. I'm not quite sure how you would have done that, because that's the first layer you put down, right?
Mm-hmm. So that goes back to, that's a kind of more recent treatment when I've been a little bit more physical with the material once it's poured. With that, I think I took a fork and I tried to pull the material out into a little kind of star-ish formation with that. And because the material doesn't completely go back, it has a memory when it's at a certain point of its curing, like viscosity. And it was just at that thicker point. Then it retained that shape. And then I could quickly pour something on top of that. So it looks like there's a groove in there, but there's not really, because it's just filled in. But what's behind it is curing too, and that kind of keeps that the lines that were drawn with the fork. And if you look at the yellow field, if you look into that one, there's a really distinct texture inside the yellow. I have 3 different colors of yellow in that. And those they were a further back layer. And so I moved them around with some kind of tool. And they also retained that kind of movement in them. They almost look like brush strokes if you look back into that. So I've been playing with that to how to make, actually manipulate the material once it's in the mold.
Right. Well, definitely your background in sculpture is totally evident, even though these are 2-dimensional works. So is the field of sculpture where you find your artistic influences?
I certainly in some respects, definitely. I mean, I've studied a lot of sculpture, but I also love drawing. And so really I look at drawing and painting to think about what I'm doing. But I have to say, I'm really interested in the artist Linda Benglis, who has worked very often with unusual synthetic materials since the late 60s. And she has done things with colored pigmented polyurethane rubber that she just kind of laid out on the floor as these shapes and forms. And so I haven't seen in person a ton of her work, just a little bit. And I'm just really hungry to see more of that work. There are other artists like Eva Hesse, of course. And when you look at that work, you want to touch it immediately. And everyone's terrified of going with those materials, of course, because of what happened to her. And so am I. I'm really, it makes me a little nervous to be working with the materials I'm working with. So I think about that a lot, and I try to be very careful. But those 2 artists definitely have influenced me and what I think about, and even what I understand about the material and how it works. Linda Benglis, for example, was not making representational objects. She was using this material purely for the joy of learning what it could do. And I feel like I also operate in that space because I want to learn about it more and how it can work and how I can work with it. So those 2, pretty important to me.
So in addition to the polyurethane rubber, I did a deep dive on your website and was excited to see that you have a lot of artworks cast with iron and bronze, glass, and fiberglass, which fiberglass I've never even thought of as a material to cast. And whenever I think of fiberglass, I just get all itchy all over. But what's your favorite material to use? I mean, you do it all, I feel like, and it's all wonderful.
Well, I want to try it all, really. And it mostly starts with what's the material mean? What's the relationship of the material to the idea that I have? And I've had the opportunity in different places to try different things too. So iron is part of my blood, literally, right? I mean, and that's very important to me, being a woman, being, person who bleeds. Sorry if that's gross, but you don't have to edit that out. I mean, hey. So anyway, that iron as a material has a great significance for me. And just also where I learned it, who I learned it from. There's a whole thing in iron casting about the family tree of who taught who. And so it's because it's a movement that only started really in the 1950s, and it's like little groups doing it all over the place. So it's very interesting to meet people from here and there doing it everywhere. But for me, iron casting is really a big part of my history. And right now I'm making a skirt, a a skirt that is 300 pounds. I'm trying to finish that. I just made it this summer, and it's going to look like a volcano, and it's going to have like smoke coming out of it too when I get it finished. I haven't had time to get to it. So that's probably my favorite one. But glass, I love doing that. And I had a studio for a while in a glass studio where they could do casting, and that was right next door. And so I came up with a project that was about science. And of course, glass and science has a big presence. So I was just like, okay, I want to do something with this kind of imagery. So that was a heck of a lot of fun. And if I get a chance to do glass again, I will do it. But it's hard. I don't know as much about doing that.
Yeah, those are really cool. That entire project was really, really cool. For all the listeners out there, if you've not been to Susan's website, go check it out. And also, obviously, come and see the show in person. But kind of piggybacking off of that a little bit, what object have you always wanted to create a mold from and cast, but never been able to? And what's the most unconventional art object that you have created in your art career?
Okay. So the first question, I knew immediately the answer to this. I have always wanted to cast a cast iron tutu. And I've got to figure out how to do that because the layers are so thin, right? The tool and the shape of it, and it will be quite heavy, but it will be so thin. And so I haven't figured this out yet, but I'm on this skirt thing now. So, I'll get there. And I want to have to engineer it so that it's suspended from the ceiling and just kind of floats there. So all of that stuff with iron takes a lot of thought, and I have to have the right place to do it. And I found this place where they cast things really large. So we'll see. And then the most unconventional object I've ever cast. Okay. So when I was in graduate school, I was more on this surrealism sort of thing, not really specifically, but kind of, right? Body casting, body oriented issues. And so I worked with dancers. I was executive director of a modern dance company. And so I did think a lot about choreography. I thought a lot about the discipline of dance. And I myself am not a dancer. I was, as a writer, I did this. So writing grants and all this stuff, but I got a wealth of just artistic education doing this. And one of the pieces I made when I was in graduate school was called Discipline is Freedom. And it's like a push broom, that you have in the studio made out of wood. They're really wide, but I had a friend who had this perfect little ballet foot, and she arched it for me and held that arch because they can. And I cast it, you dip the foot in the skin wax and then you take it out and then you cast. So I made a mold that I could cast rubber into, and I made something like, I don't know, a dozen pink cast feet, and they were kind of jelly-like because it was that softer rubber. And those feet, just resting on their toe like this, their big toe, they became the bristles in the broom. And so they're the size of a foot. So I had about a dozen feet, and they were all, the same foot across the bottom of the broom. And so when you put it and lean it against the wall, the feet, it just rests there and they wiggle a little bit. And the broom was black and the feet were pink. And so that object, like if you're standing far away from it, it kind of looks like in Fantasia, how they make the brooms and they split. And so it almost could look like the bristles kind of come together. But when you get up close to it and see what that is, you realize it's feet. And then it's very bizarre. But actually, the idea of discipline is freedom came from the very first modern dance piece I ever saw in my life. And I was an adult then. And this was made by Garth Fagan, who choreographed The Lion King. And so this is a gorgeous piece, but it also made me think about the discipline of our daily maintenance, the discipline of what we do to just kind of keep afloat in our life, and the discipline of someone in an art form where you can make your foot like this and just do it like that. That takes years to be able to do. And so this whole notion of discipline was manifest in that broom piece, and very unconventional looking, but also just still one of my favorite pieces conceptually and physically how it came out. I probably couldn't make it again. Like, I don't even know how I made it then, you know?
I love that. That sounds incredible. I have this like incredible picture of it in my brain. If you come across a picture of it, I would love to see it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that was right on the edge of film to digital. So I have slides of it that I need to have converted, but.
Well, I love hearing about how your different artistic disciplines have influenced one another, and thinking about discipline, thinking about the relationship of your artwork to the body. So there is a relationship between this current Viscosity series to the idea of dance, right? How would you describe that?
How does that play into your current work?
Well, so the notion of dance and choreography really is just, I mean, as I'm pouring the pieces, it's a very physical process, and it's a very gestural process for me. And so when I was learning from all these dancers, I learned a lot about gesture and movement, and really the physicality of the whole body, and what kind of energy that has in space. And so I think about the choreography, like even how I'm going to move around the piece just to get it made and get it done. And because of the time element in it, I kind of have to map it out. Like I have to sketch it out and I have to map it out just in my brain. And then I have to move through it. And I sometimes have to repeat it and with the same kind of energy, because it might be a different tile that's going all together. And so that's what I think about in terms of those works and choreography. But a piece that I just finished, and it was just installed, and it's at another library in Dayton, the West Library. This piece is made with light painting. And so my undergraduate degree is in photography. And one of the things I studied that actually brought me to dance was the photography of Barbara Morgan, who did photographs of Martha Graham Dance Company. And she did light painting with some of them, using the gestures and just kind of combining that with the photographer's body. And so a few times now, a few different projects, I've been able to work with dancers, and I make a light costume for them with little like fairy lights on it, and have them move to choreography and just capture the light movement on a black background, so that the only thing you see is really the body drawing itself, the energy of the body drawing. And I'm very interested. This recent piece that I did was the first time I was ever able to work with a choreographer and a dancer to a piece of music, so that the choreographer specifically made a dance to go with the photographic process, so that we would have these 5 movements of a cantata with different choreography for them. And the dancer would create these shapes in space. And so the library piece is called Cantata in 5 Movements, and it's 5 images, 40 by 50, 50 by 40 of the like kind of light drawing that came from the choreography. So and they're blue against black, and they're just, I mean, I have to say, like, again, you know, I'm just opening and closing the shutter, and the project idea was mine, and choreographer and we've worked together before, so we know kind of how to communicate about these things. And he worked with the dancer before. So it was really this amazing simpatico process. And I don't have those pictures up on my website yet because they haven't even opened the library yet. So I can't put them up there until they open it.
Wow, that's so exciting to hear about. So working with, as a true multimedia artist and then also a radio producer and a writer, do you focus on one artistic discipline? Or do you let them, in your mind influence? Well, obviously they influence one another, but do you have a time where you're deeply focused on one thing? And how does that relate to your other work?
Yeah, so I'm a very project-oriented person. I really like beginnings and middles and ends. I like closure. So while what I do does influence other things that I do, I also kind of operate a little bit in discrete segments of time. So for example, I might have an idea for a radio piece and I'll know when I can fit it in to do it. And I might apply for a commission or a grant or something like that, or a residency project. And I'll know that I'm doing it at this point in time. And then I can fit this in here and this in here. And those things might influence each other, but they also have very different skills that need concentrated time. And so that's kind of how I do it. I make sure I have concentrated time to do certain kinds of things and get that project where it needs to be, and then do a short one and then, intersperse that with ones that take longer. So I'm kind of regimented in that way.
So Susan, what influenced you to pivot from photography to sculpture and mixed media? Did you have a moment where you're just I'm over photography for right now, I want to get my hands dirty a little bit?
Yeah. So postmodernism, when I was studying photography as an undergrad in the 80s, was oh my God, no, thank you. It was so cerebral. And I had one of my advisors was an English, an English, he wasn't really an English professor, but I don't think he was a photographer. So he was really heady. And I'm a conceptual artist in a lot of ways, but some of that stuff was whoa, this takes the fun out of making photographs. So from that point on, I did still continue to make photographs, and but I also learned bronze casting at a certain point. And that's when I began to think more sculpturally. And by the time I got to graduate school, I was very interested, actually, because I had been in the dance world a little bit, more in performance art. And at that point in time, there weren't a lot of programs that were 4-dimensional or multimedia. You had to kind of choose one traditional path. And so I knew that if I chose sculpture, I could expand that into other kinds of media, including video, including photography, whatever. So it had the greatest breadth for me. So that's where I went.
I love it. And if you don't mind me asking, I'm a photographer as well, what camera?
Okay. We have to meet. We have to talk.
Yes.
More.
Yes. What camera got you through your undergraduate photography program?
Yeah. So I did not have a ton of money as a student, and I had a Pentax K1000, and that was the camera. I had that since high school because I studied photography in high school, and that camera was fine. I mean, where I went to school, they had cameras you could rent. And so I also started to get into medium format work, and I used a Yashica mat, which I loved, the little, that you looked at. So I love, and Diana's and those kinds of little plastic cameras. So I still have a collection of those. But I really, when I was at college though, I loved working with the view camera in the studio. And so when I got out of school and I could afford it, I bought a little Calumet 4x5 camera, and I did some Polaroid stuff with that and other things. And of course that was all wet darkroom stuff. So I don't even have that camera now. And I don't have access right now to a wet darkroom, and the chemicals are not friendly with me anymore. So, but I do still really love photography very much.
Yeah, there's a comeback of all of the alt processes, because there's, digital photography has a lot of manipulation to it, but it doesn't have the same feeling as using,
exactly. The tactility is,
yes. Yes. So it's great because you see all of these community darkrooms popping up. But I know that when I was in undergrad, it was like kind of moving out and everybody wanted to do digital. So a lot of places were like, well, we don't even have this equipment or chemicals to upkeep this anymore. Especially with color photography, like the color processor, like I didn't even get to learn that because they just kind of gave up. It was too expensive.
I used to have to clean that thing because I worked in the lab. Those chemicals were scary.
Yeah. I regretfully, we were not as safe as we should have been in the dark room.
Yeah.
But very cool. Awesome.
So you're teaching as part of the Ohio Arts Council Arts Learning Artist in Residence program. I'd love to hear more about that residency and who you're working with, what you're up to.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's called the Teach Arts Ohio residency program now. They've been in a transitional phase with how the program works in the state. And I started doing this right at the tail end of the old iteration of it. But now I'm speaking to you from Union City, actually Indiana, but that's because this city is split by the border of Indiana and Ohio. So a block over there is Ohio. But the art teacher at Massillon Valley High School wrote a grant to get a teaching artist to come and work with her during the year. So because Unions and Massillon Valley is right outside of town. So Union City, Indiana, is really trying to improve the downtown community through the arts and everything. They have renovated an upper story of a building to have little artist apartments in there. And so they're giving me this apartment to stay in, so that when I work with the students, we do things in the whole community. And so this residency process this year, I'm here for the whole year, like until May. The residency process is really about community-oriented art that we're doing. And so one of the first projects we did was they have a big light display in the whole area for Christmas. And so we had a 3D class and we taught them how to use jigsaws, and they made giant sort of stencil-like forms out of wood that then we took downtown and we put big spotlights through. So we projected these huge shadows with colored gels against the walls. So we have this whole sort of diorama of Christmas oriented things, but the kids learned a ton and they hadn't worked on that scale before. So the whole theme of the residency really is light. And so one of the groups that I'm working with is actually 2 photography classes. And we are creating a project that at the end of the year in April or May is going to be some kind of thing about light projection. So we're looking at a very rudimentary, I should say, projection mapping project of some sort. So whether it's we're rear screen projecting onto storefront windows from inside, that may be, whether we're looking at the downtown area as a kind of narrative that unfolds to people walking through, or whether we make giant projections with an expensive projector onto the grain silos. We don't know that yet. In fact, we just took the kids on a field trip right around town so they could start thinking about this. And so it's pretty exciting. And then we're doing casting and all kinds of other stuff this year.
Wow. Sounds like a great experience.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty cool. And we're doing a podcast. So we just did one with students. They have a taiko drumming program out here in the cornfields. I mean, they don't drum in the cornfields, but the school's in cornfields. And these kids are taiko drumming. So they get to take band or taiko drumming for their music elective. And if you don't know what taiko drums are, they're these huge Japanese drums that they beat on with these big sticks. And it's very performance oriented. So one of the students and I worked together to create a little podcast episode, which became a radio story that got played on radio station WYSO from Yellow Springs. So she's a producer now. The student is pretty cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So lots of stories to tell.
Oh, I love it. I love hearing things like that. And out of all the artist residencies that you've been part of or taught at, what is your favorite? What's your favorite? Which one has stood out to you the most?
It's hard to say. They're all experiences for me. I have never done any of the really posh ones, that everybody wants to do. A lot of mine have been teaching residencies. And so what I often do is go into a community and they might have an idea of what they want to do. And so I'll help shape the idea, but it's not like I go in there doing X. So it's always a kind of crazy learning experience for me. And I can say that I did one in Coshocton a couple of years ago, and it was just wild because we built a fountain for the art park. They had a little art park in like a gap where a building in downtown was demolished, and they made a park of it. So I made a fountain with kids, and that had sensors, and it had, like hand pumped water from a cistern, and it had, we worked with fluid engineers to do it. And we worked with an iron casting facility so the kids cast little pieces of iron that went on the fountain. I mean, I don't know how to describe what the process is of doing that, but it's crazy. It's scary. It's amazing when it works. And so that, I have to say, I learned a tremendous amount doing that. And that's the best for me, is really, I like to explore what I don't know, for better or for worse. It's stressful sometimes too.
Yeah, that sounds intense, but also really cool. I mean, I can't say that I've ever gotten to do anything like that, like as a young adult. That's so cool. They can come back and say, oh my gosh, part of my art's over there in that fountain. That's super cool.
Awesome. Yeah. One little girl, she was in 9th grade in the AutoCAD class. She designed this little flower shape that then went to an iron casting foundry, and they saw them get cast in irons, and then it comes back and there it is. And she's like, I didn't know I could do that. And it's like, yeah, you can.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so very cool.
So you're teaching the excitement of experimenting.
Yeah, I hope so.
Can apply to so many different things, but makes life exciting.
Yeah, if you're willing to do it. Yes.
Oh, I love it.
And getting the kids to say yes, yeah, we can do this is part of it.
You said you weren't part of any of the posh artist residencies, but I think that Haystack is a pretty big deal. And I was interested to know what kind of things did you do there?
So I didn't go as an artist in residence there. I just went as a workshop student, but I did get to do something really cool there. And I highly recommend Haystack for a couple of reasons. One is it's absolutely gorgeous. And I have been to that part of Maine on vacation before, and I first went to Haystack when I was there just to see it. And then I applied to be part of the the workshop, and I was accepted. And the workshop was blowing glass into molds. So we made molds. So that was something I knew how to do. And then we blew glass into them, which is something I'm terrible at. So it was 2 weeks of just making forms, doing lost wax process, making molds. It was so intense. It was a little much. It was really intense because we had a studio that had to turn over from mold making at night to glass blowing in the day. So it was nonstop, like 7 a.m. till, 2 p.m. and for 2 weeks. And I'm a little older than some of those young people who are there. And that was a lot for me, but it was really cool. And the food, you cannot believe what they feed you there. I mean, it was unreal, and so many cool people and so many interesting other workshops going on. So people always compare notes there. And it was like, oh, I wish I was in that one. Oh, I want to do that one. Oh, that's a really cool project people are doing there. So if you get to go, just apply, go to a workshop. They have work study, they have scholarship, they have, different kinds of things. I highly recommend it if you can get there.
Yeah, it's definitely on my list.
Yeah.
So it's so cool.
So just to pivot back a little bit to your exhibition here in Studio M, I wanted to know about the evolution of this body of work and how you started to bring in ideas of landscape into your artwork. And specifically, I'm curious to hear you talk about what the Prairie series means to you.
So the Prairie series got started during COVID. My friend and I, she lives in Yellow Springs and I live in Cincinnati, and we would often meet halfway and we'd take these prairie walks. So we were, for whatever reason, checking out prairies because we were obsessed with them, and they were developing a lot of new ones in the area, the parks departments and things. And they're such open, beautiful, wide spaces that that when we went there, during COVID, it was hard to even be in the same space. So it's outside. So we felt safe. There aren't a lot of people because it's kind of out in nature. It just, I don't know, represented to me the kind of space I needed to be in so much during that time. And there are prairies I go and walk in whenever I get the chance to travel to see them outside of town. There's actually one here that I haven't been to yet outside of Greenville, very near where I am. And I can't wait to get over there. But I haven't yet. So that series also afforded me the opportunity to, again, work with the kind of gestures and strokes and depth and layers of things and subtle color variations that I wanted to see in the work that I was making that was abstract. And so I think with some of those pieces, because of the gestural nature and the way, like the kind of energy of those strokes, you can also see the process more at work. It's like when you get up close to it, you're like, that's very fluid looking in there behind what at first appears to be like grasses. And so I just love the kind of way those ideas synchronized around that landscape form. And again, the notion of wanting to fill the viewer's space with the screen or the visual scape that's pushing and pulling, that's flat, but yet has depth. So I found in that myself going toward landscape.
Mm-hmm. And you were showing me in one of those artworks how the first layer had not adhered to the next layer. And so instead of a perfectly flat surface, there was this dance of these little droplets. And you mentioned that maybe that's something that you would look into doing on purpose.
Yeah. To begin thinking about sculpting it from the underside up through a mistake process, right? I think what I was doing was maybe in a piece next to it, I was probably spraying a mold release into my flat mold, and some of that migrated over onto the surface after I had already done a little bit of work there. So they came away, they didn't stick. And, those things are just amazing, because I think that if you go close enough to the piece, you'll see that, but you might not see it. But, I pointed it out to you. You would have seen it anyway, because you guys did really thorough condition reports. Awesome. Really, really good. But that just makes me think about people looking closer, and makes me think about peeling away the layers from the underside out, so I think I will play around with that in the future very carefully.
Well, I have just loved getting to talk with you and listen to you describe all of your projects, how they've influenced one another. And I would encourage everyone who is listening, if at all possible, to visit the Viscosity Series in Studio M at Massillon Museum, so that you can see this beautiful and tantalizing artwork for yourself with your own eyes and have that experience. So we would welcome you, especially at the exhibition reception, which is on January 22nd. That's a Saturday from 5 to 7 p.m. The show is on display until January 26th. So there's some time to come and enjoy it. And thank you so much for joining us, Susan.
Oh, I'm so honored. Thank you so much. I love the museum. It's gorgeous. I can't say enough about the cafe either. I love that cafe. They are wonderful. And your staff did a gorgeous job. I can tell from the pictures, and I'll see it very soon. So, I'm so grateful to you and for your wonderful questions. I'm scared of interviews, and you guys asked the best questions I've ever been asked about this work. So thank you so much.
Well, the work is truly beautiful, and I invite everybody to come and see it in person, not just on a screen, because it's a different experience to see it.
That's very true. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
The Massillon Museum would like to extend a huge thank you to our operating grantors, Arts and Stark, and the Ohio Arts Council, for making programs like this possible.